At the edge of time, where the forest whispered secrets and the river decided the fate of men, lay a village that lived by sound. Every dawn, the river sang, and by its song the people measured life, birth, harvest, death, and destiny. Then one morning, the song changed. From the river emerged a goddess not born of flesh alone but of water, spirit, and sorrow. Her voice braided with the current, and wherever it flowed, abundance followed. Hunger vanished. Barrenness broke. The people knelt, trembling between worship and fear, believing they had been chosen as custodians of something holy. As long as she sang, the world held together. But the human heart is never full for long. What began as reverence curdled into expectation. Gratitude rotted into hunger. The villagers no longer listened to the goddess's song, they measured it. Weighed it. Counted what it gave and demanded more. Each blessing tore something from her, though no one wished to see it. When one broken man discovered that her pain birthed gold, the village crossed a boundary older than the gods themselves. Faith became spectacle. Suffering became currency. And the goddess, once a bridge between worlds, became a captive shrine of endless wealth. Then, one night, the river went silent. No song. No hum. No breath. While the village drowned itself in gold and celebration, the land began to decay. Fish floated belly up. The water thickened. The air grew heavy with warning. Only one voice dared to speak the truth. The goddess was never the source of the blessing, she was the lock. Her song was not a gift, but a restraint. And now that she had stopped singing, something ancient, patient, and unforgiving had begun to rise. The final truth would not ask for repentance. It would take payment. The village of Oren woke to the same rhythm it had known for generations. Women carried clay pots to the river. Men sharpened tools for the day's work. Children chased chickens through dirt paths between huts. Everything moved according to tradition, according to the song that always came at dawn. But this morning, something felt wrong. The air hung too heavy. The birds refused to sing. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath, waiting. Old Mama Kemi was the first to notice. She stood at her doorway, her wrinkled face turned toward the river with worry deep in her eyes. For 70 years, she had woken to the river's sacred song. It always started soft, like a mother humming to her child, then grew stronger as the sun climbed higher. The song told them when to plant, when to harvest, when to celebrate, and when to mourn. But today, the song was different. It came, yes, but it sounded strained. Lower. Like someone singing through pain or exhaustion. The melody that usually lifted hearts now made them heavy with unease. Mama Kemi clutched her wooden prayer beads and whispered to the ancestors, asking them what this change meant. At the river's edge, the animals knew better than the people. Goats pulled against their ropes, refusing to go near the water. Dogs whimpered and ran back toward the village. Even the fish seemed to swim deeper, away from the surface where the strange song vibrated through the current. By midday, children had gathered at the riverbank to play as they always did. They splashed in the shallow paths, built small dams with rocks, and pretended to be warriors fighting imaginary enemies. Then one of them, a girl named Adis, screamed. Her voice cut through the afternoon heat like a knife through cloth. Within seconds, every child was screaming too, pointing at something floating between the reeds and the deeper water. The adults came running, carrying machetes and farming tools, ready to fight off whatever danger threatened their children. But when they reached the river, they stopped. Their weapons dropped to their sides. Their mouths fell open in shock and confusion. There, tangled in thick green vines and water plants, was a woman. Or something that looked like a woman. Her skin glowed with a soft light that seemed to come from inside her body. Her hair moved like it was underwater, even though half of her body rested on the muddy bank. She wore no clothes, but her body was covered in strange markings that looked like river currents drawn in silver ink. Her eyes were closed, and she breathed slowly, like someone in a very deep sleep. The chief, a tall man named Okonkwo, pushed through the crowd. He stared at the glowing woman for a long moment, his mind racing. Then he heard it, the river song grew suddenly louder, stronger, almost joyful. It was as if the water itself recognized this strange being and was calling to her, welcoming her home. They carried her to the village shrine, a circular building made of clay and decorated with symbols of the ancestors. The priest and elders argued about what to do. Some said she was a demon sent to test them. Others insisted she was a gift from the river god. While they debated, the woman's eyes slowly opened. They were the color of deep water, blue-green and endless, like you could fall into them and never reach the bottom. She sat up slowly, her glowing skin casting dancing shadows on the shrine walls. Then she began to sing. The sound that came from her throat was like nothing any of them had ever heard before. It was the river's song, but clearer, purer, more powerful. The moment her voice filled the air, the ground beneath the shrine began to tremble. Not violently, but gently, like the earth itself was breathing. Outside, impossible things started happening. The old mango tree that hadn't produced fruit in 5 years suddenly burst into bloom. Flowers that had withered in the drought opened their petals. Women who had been sick for weeks felt strength returning to their bodies. The very air tasted sweeter, cleaner, full of life. Chief Okonkwo fell to his knees. Tears ran down his weathered face as he realized what they had found. The river has sent us a goddess, he announced to the gathered crowd. We have been chosen. But when he looked at the glowing woman and called her goddess, she flinched. Just slightly. Just enough for Mama Kemi, watching from the back, to notice. And the song that flowed from the woman's lips never stopped, not even when she closed her mouth, not even when she tried to rest. It continued on its own, as if her body had no choice but to sing. The next morning brought miracles. Fishermen who had struggled for weeks suddenly pulled nets so full of fish that ropes snapped under the weight. Farmers found their fields transformed overnight, crops that should have taken months to grow stood tall and ready for harvest. Women who had prayed for years to bear children felt life stirring in their wombs. The village that had survived through hardship and sacrifice now overflowed with abundance beyond imagination. Chief Okonkwo ordered a special celebration. They brought gifts to the shrine, fresh yams, palm wine, woven cloth, and carved wooden figures. The goddess sat in the center of it all, still glowing, still singing that endless song. People came in waves, pressing close to her, reaching out to touch her skin, her hair, the hem of the simple cloth they had draped over her shoulders. And they noticed something remarkable. The closer they gathered around her, the stronger her song became. The more people who pressed near, the brighter her glow, the more powerful the blessings that flowed through the village. It was as if their presence fed her power, or perhaps her power fed on their need. Chief Okonkwo made a decision that would change everything. We must build our homes closer to the river, he declared. The goddess has blessed this place. We should live near her, honor her with our proximity, show our devotion through our presence. The elders agreed. The young men began cutting down trees. Within days, huts started rising on land that had always been considered too close to the water, too dangerous. But who feared the river now, when it had given them a goddess? Not everyone celebrated without question. There was a storyteller in the village named Chinyu, a woman with sharp eyes and a sharper mind. She noticed things others missed because she spent her life watching people, learning their patterns, understanding the stories beneath the stories they told themselves. And she noticed that each time the goddess granted a blessing, her glow dimmed just a little. Each time someone's prayer was answered, the light in those strange eyes faded by a shade. One evening, when the celebrations had finally quieted and most villagers had returned to their homes drunk on palm wine and joy, Chinyu approached the shrine. The goddess sat alone, her endless song softer now, almost mournful. Chinyu knelt beside her, not to ask for anything, but simply to listen. That's when she heard it, 3 words whispered beneath the song, so quiet they were almost lost in the melody. Too much, being taken. Chinyu's blood went cold. She looked at the goddess's face and saw exhaustion there, the kind that lives deep in bones and souls. What do you mean? Chinyu asked softly. But before the goddess could answer, footsteps approached. Chief Okonkwo entered the shrine with several elders behind him. His face darkened when he saw Chinyu there. The goddess needs rest, he said, his voice carrying warning. She should not be disturbed with questions. Chinyu stood slowly, meeting his eyes. She just said that too much is being taken from her. Perhaps we should listen, but Okonkwo raised his hand, silencing her. You misheard. The goddess is happy to bless her people. That is her purpose. The elders nodded in agreement. The next day, Okonkwo made a public announcement that no one should spread rumors or doubts about the goddess's gifts. Chinyu said nothing more, but her worry grew like a shadow at noon. The change happened slowly, so slowly that no one noticed when gratitude transformed into expectation. At first, villagers had approached the goddess with humility, with prayers and offerings, with please and thank you trembling on their lips. But as weeks passed and every request was granted, the prayers became demands. The offerings became smaller. The please disappeared entirely. Make my fields produce twice as much, one farmer ordered, not asked. Heal my son immediately, another demanded, as if the goddess were a servant who had been too slow in her duties. I want gold coins, not just full fishing nets, a young man insisted, his voice sharp with entitlement. The goddess granted each request, her song continuing without pause, but Chinyu noticed the tremor that had entered that perfect melody. Like a crack spreading through pottery. Then came the day when the goddess did something she had never done before. A wealthy trader from a neighboring village arrived, having heard rumors of the miraculous being. He strode into the shrine without removing his shoes, without bowing, without any sign of respect. Make me the richest man in all the land, he demanded, not even looking at her face. I will give you nothing in return. That is your purpose. The goddess's song stopped. For 3 heartbeats, there was complete silence. The river itself seemed to hold its breath. Then she spoke, her voice quiet but clear, no. The single word hung in the air like thunder. The trader's face went purple with rage. He lunged toward her, but Chief Okonkwo's guards held him back. The man was dragged from the shrine, screaming curses and threats. But the damage was done. The goddess had refused. She had revealed that her power had limits. And in that moment, the villagers realized something terrible. They had come to depend completely on someone they did not understand and could not control. That night, a man named Adamu sat alone on the riverbank. He had once been the village's best fisherman, blessed with strong arms and keen eyes that could spot fish in murky water. But a year ago, his wife had died giving birth to their stillborn son. Grief had broken something inside him. He stopped fishing. Stopped eating properly. Stopped living in any real way. He existed like a ghost, going through motions without purpose. The other villagers avoided him now. He reminded them of pain in a time when they wanted only to celebrate. So Adamu sat alone in the darkness, tears running down his face, not asking the goddess for anything because he knew nothing could bring back what he had lost. He simply cried, releasing the grief he had carried for too long. He didn't notice when one of his tears fell on a smooth stone beside him. Didn't see the moment it touched the surface and transformed, hardening into something that caught the moonlight and gleamed. It wasn't until he wiped his eyes and looked down that he saw it, a small piece of gold, perfect and pure, sitting where his tear had fallen. Adamu's heart stopped. His hands shook as he picked up the gold piece, turning it over in his palm. It couldn't be real. It wasn't possible. But the weight of it, the way it caught the light, told him the truth. His tear had become gold. But how? Why? Then he remembered, the goddess's tear had touched his shoulder earlier that week when he had passed the shrine. She had been singing, and a single tear had rolled down her glowing cheek. He had felt it land on his skin, warm and strange. Could that be connected? The next night, Adamu returned with a plan growing in his desperate mind. Adamu approached the shrine after dark, when most villagers slept. The goddess sat where she always sat, singing her endless song, glowing in the darkness. He knelt before her, and he lied. He told her his wife had died today, not a year ago. He described his stillborn son as if he had just lost him yesterday. He spoke of pain so fresh and terrible that even he, telling false stories about real grief, began to cry. And the goddess, who could not tell the difference between old sorrow-spoken new and fresh tragedy, wept with him. Her tears fell like rain, and when they touched the ground, they transformed into gold coins that clinked against the stone floor. Adamu's heart raced. It worked. It actually worked. Her tears became gold when she believed the pain was real. Night after night, Adamu returned. Each time, he invented a new tragedy. A brother killed by a lion. A sister stolen by raiders. A mother dead from plague. Each lie brought tears to the goddess's eyes, and each tear became gold that Adamu collected in a leather pouch hidden beneath his ragged clothes. He told himself he would stop soon. That he only needed enough to rebuild his life. But gold has a way of making enough feel like not quite enough. What Adamu didn't know was that someone watched from the shadows of the forest. Small eyes witnessed his nightly visits. Young ears heard his false confessions. Children saw the gold. And children, as everyone knows, cannot keep secrets. By the time the sun rose on the seventh day of Adamu's deception, every child in the village knew the truth. By noon, every adult knew too. The village erupted like a nest of angry hornets. People ran through the streets, grabbing neighbors by the arms, voices rising in disbelief and growing greed. Her tears turned to gold. Real gold, not just blessings. We've been wasting time asking for fish when we could have wealth. Arguments broke out. Fights started. Someone's chicken coop was knocked over in the chaos. Children cried, confused by the sudden madness that had gripped their parents. Chief Okonkwo stood in the center of it all, his face like carved stone. He raised his arms for silence, and eventually, the noise died down to angry mutters. Is this true? He demanded, his voice carrying over the crowd. Has anyone else witnessed this? Dozens of voices answered at once, all confirming what the children had seen. Adamu, cornered and ashamed, finally pulled out his leather pouch and spilled its contents on the ground. Gold coins gleamed in the afternoon sun. The crowd pressed forward, reaching for the coins, for proof, for their share. Okonkwo's guards pushed them back. The chief stared at the gold for a long moment, his mind calculating, weighing possibilities. Then he made an announcement that would seal the village's fate. Tonight, we all go to the river. We will see this miracle with our own eyes. We will know the full extent of the goddess's power. His voice carried something new, something that made Mama Kemi's ancient heart go cold with dread. It was the voice of a man who had just discovered a resource to exploit. Not a divine being to worship, but a tool to use. The crowd cheered. The goddess, in her shrine, stopped singing for just a moment. Then the song resumed, but this time, it sounded like morning. The entire village gathered at the shrine as the sun set, painting the sky in shades of blood and fire. Chief Okonkwo stood before the goddess, his arms crossed over his chest. The elders flanked him on both sides. The crowd pressed close, hundreds of eyes fixed on the glowing woman who had brought them so much and who they now saw in a completely different light. Show us, Okonkwo commanded. Not asked. Commanded. Cry for us. Let your tears become gold so we may witness this miracle. The goddess looked at him with those deep water eyes, and for the first time, the villagers saw something they had never noticed before. Fear. She was afraid of them. I cannot cry on command, she said softly, her voice barely audible over the murmur of the crowd. Tears come from true sorrow. I cannot manufacture pain. Then remember your sorrow, Okonkwo insisted, his voice growing harder. Surely a goddess has known loss. Surely you have memories that bring tears. The goddess shook her head slowly. That is not how this works. That is not what I am meant to, but she never finished her sentence. The crowd, drunk on the possibility of wealth, began to mock her. They laughed at the idea of a goddess who couldn't perform a simple trick. They jeered, calling her useless, calling her false. Chinu pushed through the crowd, her voice rising desperately. Stop this. Can't you see what you're doing? But her words were drowned out by the jeers and demands. Chief Okonkwo raised his hand, and the guards moved forward. Before anyone could protest, they grabbed the goddess by her arms, lifting her from where she sat. She struggled, her song breaking into fragments of sound. And for the first time since she had arrived, actual fear spread through the village. Because when a goddess struggles, when she fights against her captors like any mortal woman, the distance between divine and human collapses. And people realize they have crossed a line that can never be uncrossed. They built a cage and called it a shrine. They built it from wood blessed by priests, decorated it with gold offerings, and placed soft cushions inside. But no matter how beautiful the prison, it was still a prison. The goddess sat inside, no longer free to move through the village, no longer able to disappear into the river at night as she once had. Guards stood watch, not to protect her, but to protect their access to her. The first foster came that night. They brought before her a woman whose child had truly died that morning, killed by a snake bite. The mother wailed her grief, and the goddess, unable to shield herself from such real pain, wept. Her tear hit the ground and became gold. The crowd roared in triumph. They had proof. They had control. Chief Okonkwo pocketed the gold coin and immediately ordered more grieving people brought forward. Anyone who had lost someone. Anyone who had suffered. Anyone whose pain could be performed for profit. One by one, they came. The goddess cried. Gold accumulated in baskets that the chief's guards carried away to his personal hut. The goddess's song, which had always been beautiful and strong, began to crack. It came in gasps now, between sobs, broken by exhaustion and something deeper than physical tiredness. Her glow dimmed until she looked almost human, almost ordinary. Only her eyes remained the same, deep and endless, but now filled with something the villagers preferred not to see. Betrayal. Chinu watched from the edge of the crowd, tears streaming down her own face. She caught Mama Kemi's eye, and the old woman shook her head slowly, her wrinkled lips moving in silent prayer. They both knew the same truth. They had committed a sin so great that even their ancestors would turn their faces away. They had taken the holy and made it profane. They had taken the sacred and made it a spectacle. And the worst part was that most of the village didn't care. They saw only the gold. For 3 days and nights, the ritual continued. They called it worship, but it was torture dressed in religious clothing. Groups took turns, making sure the goddess never rested, never stopped producing what they wanted. Some brought real grief. Others invented tragedies, following Adamu's original sin. The goddess could no longer tell the difference. She cried for all of it, her tears falling like rain, each one becoming gold that filled the chief's storehouses. Cry for us. Cry for us. The chant started on the morning of the 4th day. Hundreds of voices, speaking in unison, demanding tears like they were demanding rain from the sky. The sound echoed off the hills, harsh and terrible. But something changed that morning. The goddess stopped singing. The melody that had been the heartbeat of the village for months, that had never ceased even in sleep, suddenly ended. The silence that followed was louder than any sound they had ever heard. The villagers looked at each other, confused. Make her sing, someone shouted. The song brings the blessings. Okonkwo gestured to his guards, who shook the goddess, slapped her face, tried to force the song from her throat. But no sound came. Her lips moved soundlessly. Her eyes stared at nothing. The song was gone. Yet the gold kept coming. Even without the song, even without the visible light, the goddess's tears still transformed. The villagers celebrated, thinking they had found a way to get the wealth without the noise. But no one noticed that the river had stopped making any sound at all. The water that had always hummed with life now flowed in complete, unnatural silence. And beneath the surface, where human eyes couldn't see, the fish began to die. One by one, they floated belly up, their scales dulled, their eyes blank. The river was changing. Something was waking up. The silence should have terrified them, but gold is a powerful distraction. While the goddess sat motionless in her cage, her tears flowing without sound, the village accumulated wealth beyond comprehension. The chief's storehouses overflowed. Common farmers held more gold than kings. Children played with coins that could have bought entire herds of cattle. Oren had become the richest village in memory, possibly in all the land. But wealth cannot buy wisdom. The elders noticed the signs first but chose to ignore them. The mangoes that had bloomed so magnificently now rotted on the branches overnight, turning black and foul-smelling. The crops that had grown tall and green began to wither, their stalks bending like old men's backs. Women who had conceived during the early blessings now felt their babies stop moving in their wombs. "It's nothing," Chief Okonkwo insisted when Mama Kemi brought her concerns to him. "A small price for wealth. The land is tired. It will recover." But the land wasn't tired. It was dying. Not slowly, but rapidly, as if something was actively draining life from the soil. The grass turned brown in perfect circles that spread outward from the river. Trees lost their leaves even though it wasn't the dry season. Animals that drank from the river began acting strangely, walking in circles, attacking their own young. The night sky changed too. Stars that had always shone brightly now seemed dimmer, as if a veil was being drawn across the heavens. The moon took on a reddish tint that made it look like a wound in the darkness. Old people whispered that they had seen such signs before, in stories passed down from ancestors about times when the gods were angry. But the young people laughed at such superstitions. They clutched their gold and insisted everything was fine. The goddess still cried. The wealth still came. What else mattered? In the cage shrine, the goddess lay on her side, barely breathing, her skin no longer glowing at all. She looked like any dying woman. But her tears never stopped flowing. Chief Okonkwo declared a grand festival to celebrate their prosperity. "We have been chosen by the gods," he announced. "Let us show our gratitude with the greatest feast this land has ever seen." Musicians were hired from neighboring villages. Dancers practiced complex routines. Women cooked vast amounts of food, slaughtering goats and chickens, preparing stews and rice dishes, baking bread in outdoor ovens. The festival lasted 3 days. People wore their finest clothes, new garments purchased with goddess gold. They drank palm wine until they couldn't walk straight. They danced until their feet bled. They sang songs about their wealth, their blessings, their chosen status. The noise was deafening, deliberately so. As if by making enough sound, they could drown out the uncomfortable silence that had replaced the goddess's song. But on the third night of the festival, while people celebrated with abandon, Chinyu slipped away from the crowd and went to the cage shrine. What she saw there would haunt her for the rest of her life. The goddess lay motionless on the cushions, her eyes open but unseeing. Her chest barely moved with breath. Her skin, once glowing with inner light, now looked grey and thin, like paper about to tear. Tears still flowed from her eyes, but they seemed to drain her life force with each drop. "We are killing her," Chinyu whispered, horror choking her voice. She reached through the wooden bars to touch the goddess's hand, and the flesh felt cold, so cold that Chinyu jerked back in shock. The goddess's eyes slowly turned to look at Chinyu, and in them, the storyteller saw something terrible. Acceptance. The goddess had stopped fighting. She had surrendered to her fate. Behind the shrine, hidden from the festival's torchlight, Chinyu noticed something that made her blood freeze. The river had receded. The water level had dropped by at least 3 feet, exposing muddy banks and rocks that hadn't seen air in generations. And in the exposed mud, strange marks appeared, like something massive had been sleeping there and was now beginning to stir. That night, Chinyu couldn't sleep. The sounds of the festival finally died down near dawn, and in the quiet that followed, she found herself drawn back to the river. She stood on the bank, staring at the water that now seemed darker, thicker, more like oil than like the clear stream it had been. Then she heard something that made her skin prickle with primitive fear. Voices. Not one voice, but many, whispering beneath the water's surface. They weren't speaking any language Chinyu recognized, but somehow she understood the intent behind the sounds. They were angry. They were hungry. They were waiting. She fell to her knees, pressing her ear to the damp ground, and that's when the truth hit her like a physical blow. The river had never been singing alone. All this time, the goddess's song hadn't been creating the melody by herself. The river had been singing through her. Or more accurately, something in the river had been singing through her. The goddess's voice had been a channel, a vessel, a bridge between whatever lived in those depths and the world above. Her song hadn't been a blessing. It had been a barrier. A restraint. A lock holding something back. And now the lock was broken. The song was gone. The restraint had been removed. Chinyu ran back to the village, her heart hammering against her ribs. She burst into Chief Okonkwo's hut without permission, startling him awake. "We have to let her go," Chinyu shouted, her voice breaking with panic. The song wasn't a gift. It was a warning. She was holding something back, and we've broken her, and now, but her words were cut off by a scream from outside. A woman's scream, high and terrible. Then another scream. Then shouts of alarm. The village was waking to a nightmare. The body of young Chidi, the chief's nephew, was found floating in the shallows. The water was barely knee-deep where he lay, yet somehow he had drowned. His lungs were full of river water. His eyes were open, staring at nothing. But here's what made the death impossible to understand: Chidi was a strong swimmer. He could hold his breath longer than any other boy in the village. There was no reason for him to drown in water so shallow a toddler could stand in it. His mother wailed, pulling at her hair, collapsing into the mud. Other women gathered around her, trying to offer comfort, but their own faces showed the same fear. Something was very wrong. The men pulled Chidi's body from the water, preparing to take him to the burial grounds. But as they lifted him onto the bank, something impossible happened. The water, which had been still and calm, suddenly surged. A wave rose up from nowhere, grabbed the body, and pulled it back under. The men stumbled backward, shouting in shock. They stared at the spot where Chidi's body had disappeared, but the water had returned to its glassy stillness. No ripples. No movement. Nothing to indicate that anything had just been pulled beneath the surface. Then someone pointed at the river with a shaking finger. "Look," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Something's moving down there." They all looked. And they all saw it. Deep beneath the surface, in the darkest part of the river, something massive moved. It was too big to be a fish, too fluid to be a crocodile. It moved like a shadow, like smoke, like something that wasn't entirely physical. And it was rising. Slowly, steadily, moving toward the surface. The villagers backed away from the river's edge. Children were snatched up and held tight. Women clutched protective charms. Men gripped their machetes even though they all knew, deep in their primitive brains, that metal weapons would be useless against whatever was coming. In the chaos, nobody noticed old Mama Kemi climbing down into the dry sections of the riverbed that had been exposed when the water receded. She moved carefully, her old bones protesting, but determination pushed her forward. She had remembered something from her own grandmother's stories. Something about the shrine and the old times. Something carved in stone. Her fingers found what she was looking for, ancient markings carved into rocks that hadn't been visible in living memory. She brushed away mud and moss, revealing symbols and pictures that told a story. A story the village had forgotten. A story that explained everything. The carvings showed a creature. Something vast and terrible, with too many limbs, too many mouths, made of water and darkness and ancient hunger. The old people had called it different names in different times. The devourer. The drowned god. The thing below. And there, carved alongside the monster, was the figure of a woman. Not a goddess born of divine will, but a warden. A guardian placed at the river by ancient priests to keep the creature contained. Her song wasn't meant to bless the village. It was meant to keep the monster asleep, pacified, restrained. As long as she sang, the creature remained dormant. As long as she maintained her strength, the lock held. But the village had drained her. They had taken and taken until nothing remained. And now the lock was broken. The door was open. The monster was waking up. Mama Kemi's hands shook as she traced the final carving. It showed the monster rising, and in its wake, the symbols for death, destruction, and the end of all things. She looked up at the village, at the people she had known her entire life, and tears ran down her weathered face. They had doomed themselves. They had traded temporary wealth for permanent destruction. And worst of all, they had done it with their eyes wide open, ignoring every warning. Mama Kemi climbed out of the riverbed and went straight to find Chinyu. Together, they confronted Chief Okonkwo in his hut, where he sat surrounded by baskets of gold coins, counting his wealth even as the village fell apart outside. "We know the truth," Chinyu said, her voice steady despite her fear. "The carvings tell everything. She was never a goddess sent to bless us. She was a warden sent to protect us. And we've destroyed her." Okonkwo looked up from his gold, his face haggard and older than it had been weeks ago. For a moment, something flickered in his eyes. Shame. Regret. But then his jaw hardened. "I know," he admitted, his voice rough. "I've always known. My grandfather told me the old stories before he died. He warned me that if a warden ever appeared, we must protect her at all costs. Never demand anything. Never take more than she freely offered." Chinyu stared at him, horror and rage mixing in her chest. "You knew? You knew, and you let us do this anyway." Okonkwo stood, knocking over a basket of gold that spilled across the floor in a golden waterfall. "I thought I could control it," he shouted, his composure finally cracking. "I thought if we had enough wealth, we could hire armies, build walls, pay priests from other lands to reseal whatever was down there. I thought gold could solve anything." "Gold solves nothing when the world ends," Mama Kemi said quietly. As if responding to her words, the ground shook. Not gently this time, but violently. Huts trembled. Clay pots fell from shelves and shattered. Outside, people screamed. The three of them ran to the door and looked toward the river. The water was rising. Not flooding slowly, but surging upward in a wave that defied all natural laws. It rose higher than the banks, higher than the trees, a wall of dark water that seemed to reach for the sky. And in the center of that impossible wave, they saw it. The thing from the carvings. The creature from nightmares. It was rising. The crops died first. Not gradually, but instantly, as if all life was sucked out of them in a single breath. Cornfields turned to ash. Yam mounds collapsed into dust. Fruit trees withered into twisted black skeletons. The earth itself seemed to reject the village's presence, the ground cracking open in long fissures that swallowed planted seeds and growing things alike. Farmers ran to their fields, trying desperately to salvage something, anything, but their hands came away covered in dirt that smelled of rot and death. Then someone tried to use their gold. A man named Obiore took his coins to a traveling merchant, trying to buy food from outside the village. But when the merchant touched the gold, he screamed and dropped it. The coins had turned black, covered in a film that looked like dried blood. Every piece of gold in the village was the same. Corrupted. Cursed. Worthless. The land was rejecting the stolen wealth. The earth knew what they had done and refused to accept payment made from suffering. People ran to their homes, dumping out bags and baskets of gold, watching in horror as the coins turned to black sludge in their hands. All that wealth, all that treasure, becoming nothing but proof of their greed. By sunset, the village was starving. Not because there was no food in the world, but because their land would no longer provide it. The river would no longer give fish. The earth would no longer grow crops. They had broken the natural order, and now nature itself turned against them. People gathered in the village square, their faces gaunt with fear and hunger, and for the first time, they understood what they had truly lost. Not just the goddess's song. Not just her blessings. But the basic right to survive on this land. Desperation makes people do terrible things. The villagers, starving and terrified, turned their anger toward the only target they could reach. They gathered outside the cage shrine, hundreds of them, their voices rising in demands and pleas that sounded exactly the same. "Make her sing again," someone shouted. "Force her. We'll all die without the song." Others took up the cry. They pressed against the wooden bars, reaching through with grasping hands. Chief Okonkwo tried to restore order, but his authority had crumbled along with everything else. People pushed him aside. They broke open the cage door. They dragged the goddess out into the open, her limp body offering no resistance. Her eyes were still open but empty, her skin cold as river stones. "Sing," they screamed at her, shaking her, slapping her face. Save us. You have to save us. But no sound came from her throat. Her lips moved soundlessly, forming words no one could hear. Chinua pushed through the crowd and knelt beside the goddess, cradling her head. Please, Chinua whispered, tears streaming down her face. Please, if you can still speak, tell us what to do. Tell us how to fix this. The goddess's eyes slowly focused on Chinua's face. Her lips continued moving, and finally, Chinua understood what she was saying. 3 words, repeated over and over. It is awake. The crowd fell silent, those words spreading like poison through their ranks. Then the goddess spoke one more time, her voice barely a whisper but somehow carrying to every ear. It is awake. And it is hungry. And I can no longer stop it. Her eyes closed. Her chest stopped moving. The last thing she whispered before her spirit fled was, run. But there was nowhere to run. Because at that exact moment, the river opened. The water split apart like a wound, revealing darkness beneath that went down and down and down, deeper than any river should go. And from that darkness, something began to rise. What emerged from the river was beyond description. It had the shape of water but the presence of nightmare. It moved like shadow but felt solid as stone. It had faces, dozens of them, appearing and disappearing in the flowing darkness of its body. Mouths opened and closed, screaming in voices that sounded like drowning. Eyes blinked open in clusters, seeing everything, judging everything. The creature was vast, so tall that its highest parts disappeared into the clouds. It was made of the river itself, but also of something darker, older, more fundamental than water. This was what had always lived beneath. This was what the goddess's song had kept contained. This was the devourer, the drowned god, the thing below. And it had been patient. So very patient. It looked at the village. And in that gaze, every person felt their sins weighed and measured. They saw their own greed reflected back at them, magnified, made monstrous. They saw what they had become. They saw what they had done to the woman who was meant to protect them. And they understood, finally, that there would be consequences. But here's what terrified them most, the goddess's body, lying still and cold on the ground, suddenly smiled. Her dead face arranged itself into an expression of peace, maybe even satisfaction. As if this ending was something she had known was coming. As if she had accepted it long ago. As if, in some way, she welcomed it. Because the truth was simple and terrible, she had been a lock, yes. But she had also been a prisoner. Bound by duty, bound by the ancient priest, bound by her nature to sing the same restraining song for eternity. And the village, in their greed, had broken her bonds. They had freed her from her endless task. Her smile was the smile of someone finally allowed to rest. The creature spoke. Not in words, but in feelings that crashed through every mind like waves. It communicated in memories, in emotions, in truths that couldn't be hidden or denied. And its message was clear, there would be a price. The village had taken what wasn't theirs. They had tortured the guardian. They had broken the sacred trust. Payment was required. But the creature offered one choice. One final chance. Return everything. Every piece of gold that came from the goddess's pay must be thrown back into the river. Every coin, every nugget, every trace of wealth born from suffering must be given back to the depths. If the village did this, if they surrendered everything willingly, then perhaps, the creature would return to its sleep. Perhaps the land could begin to heal. Perhaps survival was still possible. The crowd looked at each other. They looked at their homes where gold still sat hidden in pots and baskets. They looked at the jewelry around their necks, the coins in their pockets, the wealth they had suffered to obtain. Give it all back. Return everything. Become poor again after tasting such riches. Chief Okonkwo stepped forward, his face set with determination. We will return it, he declared. All of it. We will throw every piece into the river. We will pay the price. But even as he spoke, someone in the crowd shouted, no. That gold is ours. We suffered for it. We earned it. Others agreed. Arguments broke out. Fighting started. People who had been neighbors and friends turned on each other, screaming about fairness, about rights, about what they deserved. The creature watched them tear themselves apart, and in the shifting patterns of its watery form, something that might have been disappointment rippled through its massive body. They had learned nothing. Even facing extinction, they chose greed over survival. The truth revealed itself in layers, each one more devastating than the last. Mama Kemi, standing in the ruins of her village, finally understood the complete story. The goddess's song had never been mercy. Every note, every melody, every blessed vibration had been a chain wrapped around the creature below. The goddess hadn't been giving the village gifts. She had been containing a monster, and the blessings were just side effects of her restraining power flowing through the land. When the village took more and more from her, they weren't just weakening her, they were weakening the chains. Every tear that turned to gold was a link breaking. Every forced cry was a lock opening. The creature had felt every moment of her suffering, and it had grown stronger with each one, feeding on her pain, waiting for the moment when she would finally fail. And her silence. That wasn't surrender. That was the moment the final chain broke. The moment the last lock opened. The moment she could no longer hold it back. Her silence was the sound of protection ending. The goddess had tried to warn them. Too much is being taken, she had whispered. But they hadn't listened. They never listened. Chini knelt beside the goddess's body, understanding now why she had smiled at the end. The goddess had spent however many centuries bound to this duty, singing the same restraining song, holding back the same hungry darkness, never resting, never stopping, never free. And the village, in their cruelty, had given her what divine law wouldn't allow. Release. Death. An ending. The river made its choice then. It didn't wait for the village to agree. It didn't give them more time to decide. The creature had seen their hearts, measured their worth, and found them wanting. The payment would be taken, not given. And the price would be higher than gold. The flood came without warning. One moment the creature stood towering over the village. The next, it collapsed back into the river, and the water came rushing after it like a tsunami. Walls of water taller than the tallest trees crashed through Oran, sweeping away huts, animals, people. The sound was deafening, a roar like the earth itself was screaming. People ran, but there was nowhere to run to. The water was everywhere, rising faster than anyone could climb, pulling everything back toward the river's embrace. Families were separated. Children were torn from their mothers' arms. The elderly disappeared beneath the surface. Gold coins floated in the churning water, glinting mockingly in the chaos before sinking like stones, dragged down to depths where sunlight would never reach them again. Chief Okonkwo found himself clinging to a tree, watching his village disappear. His gold, his power, his plans, all of it was being erased as if it had never existed. He saw Adamu, the man who had started this nightmare, swept past in the current, his mouth open in a scream no one could hear. He saw the shrine where the goddess had been caged, now crushed beneath the weight of water. But he also saw something strange. Some people weren't drowning. Mama Kemi stood on her doorstep, water swelling around her ankles but rising no higher. Chini walked through the flood like it was merely rain, untouched by the violence. A handful of others, the ones who had spoken against the torture, who had tried to stop it, who had never demanded anything from the goddess, they remained standing while the village collapsed around them. The river was taking only those who had taken from her. Only those who had demanded and consumed and tortured. Only those who had turned blessing into weapon. The innocent, the children too young to have participated, the few voices of conscience, they were being spared. The creature wasn't mindlessly destructive. It was precise. It was just. Years later, a new village rose far from the cursed river. The survivors who had been spared built their homes on higher ground, near a different water source, in a place where the earth didn't remember their sins. They told stories to their children about what had happened, about the price of greed, about the difference between receiving blessings and demanding them. Chinu became the village storyteller, teaching the young ones to recognize the difference between gratitude and entitlement. Mama Kemi lived to be 100, her final years spent carving the true story into stone so it would never be forgotten. The survivors never accumulated wealth again. They lived simply, humbly, always remembering that they existed only because the river had shown mercy they didn't deserve. But sometimes, late at night, when the wind was right, Chini would walk to the edge of the village and listen. She swore she could still hear it, faint and far away, carried on currents of air that had traveled across the land from that cursed river. A song. Beautiful and terrible, restraining and powerful, eternal and unchanging. A new warden had taken the old one's place. The cycle had begun again. Somewhere, in some village that didn't yet know what they had found, another glowing woman was singing. Another group of people was receiving blessings they didn't understand. And Chinu prayed they would learn from Oran's mistake. That they would receive with gratitude, not demand with greed. That they would protect their guardian, not exploit her. But late one night, as she stood listening to that distant song, she heard something else beneath it. Something that made her blood run cold. A child's voice, excited and greedy, asking, "Mama, why is she crying? And why did her tears turn to gold?" History, Chinu realized with horror, was preparing to repeat itself. The river still sang, yes. But it sang only for itself now. It had learned that humans couldn't be trusted with sacred things. The blessings still existed, somewhere in the world, but they would never again be freely given to people. The age of divine gifts had ended the day Oran destroyed its goddess. And deep below, in the darkest places where water met ancient stone, the creature waited. Patient. Hungry. Ready. Because it knew the truth that humans kept forgetting, greed is endless, suffering is patient, and monsters sleep lightly.